April 1945, Okinawa. The air trembled with the sound of boots crunching coral dust and the low thud of distant mortars. Smoke rolled across the hillside where a small group of Japanese civilians had emerged from a cave, ragged and ash-streaked. They were mostly women, clutching babies whose faces were hollow from days without food. A few soldiers from the U.S. 7th Infantry stopped dead at the sight. One man raised his rifle, finger poised on the trigger. The mothers froze. A child whimpered, and in that heartbeat of sound the whole world held its breath. Every Japanese villager had been told that surrender meant torture, humiliation, or death. Propaganda leaflets warned, "The Americans will kill your children first." So when they saw those rifles rise, instinct screamed that the end had come. One woman pulled her daughter behind her body. Another whispered a prayer to ancestors who died long before the Empire began this war. The soldiers barked a word none of them understood. Stop. Then silence, no shots, just the hiss of wind across wrecked terrain. The American sergeant at the front, helmet streaked with mud, saw something he didn't expect, tiny hands trembling under torn blankets. His men hesitated. Reports later recorded 30-0 Okinawan civilians surrendering that month, but for these women, surrender was still an unthinkable shame. The sergeant's finger twitched, then eased off the trigger. Slowly, he lowered his weapon. That single motion rippled like a signal through both sides. The women didn't understand it yet, but that gesture, lowering instead of firing, would divide their past from everything that came next. One soldier slung his rifle behind his back. Another knelt, reaching for a canteen. The women flinched as if struck. The cave still loomed behind them, black and breathing smoke, the echo of war pulsing from within. In that moment, mercy looked like madness. None of them could tell whether the soldier's hesitation meant pity or cruelty disguised as calm. The child's eyes widened as the American's shadow crossed her face. Somewhere behind, a wounded soldier groaned, and the war continued to thunder, but here, on this patch of coral earth, something broke. Not just fear, a pattern, and when the sergeant unscrewed his canteen cap, offering it forward, the unthinkable began. The cave still breathed behind them, hot, damp, and echoing like a wounded lung. When the Americans stepped closer, their flashlights cut through the darkness, catching movement. The women hesitated, terrified the soldiers would follow inside. One of them whispered, "There are dead in there." The sergeant motioned for a medic. Together they entered, rifles lowered but ready. The stench hit first, sweat, decay, and gunpowder fused into one choking fog. Inside lay the remnants of weeks of hiding. Pots hammered from shell casings, empty rice sacks, a torn photo of a husband in uniform pinned to a rock with a bayonet. The soldiers realized this wasn't a bunker. It was a grave and a home at the same time. Some civilians had sealed themselves in when bombardments began. Others died from smoke or starvation. According to U.S. reports, many had survived nearly 40 days underground with no light, feeding on roots and rainwater. One private muttered under his breath, "How did they even live?" The interpreter translated quietly, and one woman replied, "We didn't." Outside, sunlight cut across the ridge, but it looked unreal, too bright for what they'd seen. The women were led out one by one, blinking hard as if daylight itself burned. They expected punishment or interrogation, not compassion. Their minds still replayed imperial warnings. Surrender meant dishonor, capture meant shame. Yet, these soldiers kept their distance, careful, almost gentle. The oldest woman fell to her knees, pressing her forehead into the dirt. "Finish it," she murmured, expecting death. No shot came. One soldier noticed a child clutching a tin can with holes punched in its side. Inside were grey ashes. When he asked, the interpreter whispered, "Her brother." For a moment, even the wind went still. The Americans didn't speak. They couldn't. In war diaries later found, Japanese survivors called such caves the stomach of ghosts. Every breath inside had been a negotiation with death. Emerging alive felt like betrayal. And yet, here they were. standing under an enemy flag and still breathing. The sergeant gestured to his men. He reached into his pouch, pulled out a canteen, and handed it to the nearest woman. The metal clinked softly, a strange, foreign kindness. The woman's trembling hands lifted it, unsure whether it was mercy or poison. The woman's fingers barely wrapped around the metal canteen. Her skin, cracked and grey from dehydration, trembled as she tilted it toward her lips. The water smelled sharp, chemical, foreign. The first drop touched her tongue and she recoiled, chlorine. The Americans watched in silence. Then the sergeant motioned again, gentle but firm. Drink. She hesitated, then raised it once more. The liquid burned down her throat, strange but alive. For the women who had survived weeks in darkness, this single swallow felt like betrayal and salvation at once. Every instinct screamed that it was a trick. But their bodies, hollow and shaking, didn't care. The first gulp became a second. A child next to her reached for the canteen, eyes glazed with hunger, not thirst. A soldier crouched, unscrewed another cap, and passed it over. The tin cups clinked against steel, echoing like a ritual in the rubble. Reports from the 10th Army note that over 40 zero civilians were processed after the battle. Each one medically checked, photographed, fed, and tagged. But statistics don't capture the sound of that moment, parched lips meeting metal, the hush of disbelief. I thought it was poison, one survivor later said in testimony, but it was the first thing that made me feel human again. A medic kneeled beside them, scanning for wounds. One woman's arm was swollen from infection. Another's ribs jutted like cage bars. The medic rinsed her cut with antiseptic, and she gasped, not from pain, but shock. No soldier had ever touched her with care. Behind them, smoke curled from the hillside as artillery rumbled farther north. War still raged, but here it had paused. The sergeant scribbled something in his logbook. Civilians secure, he wrote. Then he looked at the cave, where darkness still lingered like a second army. He didn't know it yet, but these captives would soon be moved to a site that wasn't quite a prison, not quite a hospital, a place that defied the idea of captivity itself. The women didn't know the word for it. They only followed when the soldiers gestured, still clutching their tin cups, not realizing this was just the first test of trust. They reached it by dusk, a clearing that looked nothing like a prison. The smell of medicine hung in the air, sharp and clean. Rows of tents stretched across the hillside, marked with red crosses instead of barbed wire. American nurses moved between the rows, carrying clipboards and trays of bandages. To the women, it felt unreal. They'd been told enemy camps meant torture, yet the only sounds here were murmurs, the clatter of tin bowls, and the distant hum of generators. The sergeant guided them to a tent where a nurse waited. Pale, exhausted, uniform sleeves rolled up. The women recoiled instinctively. She smiled, a small, tired smile that didn't look like victory. One child whimpered, clutching his mother's sleeve. The nurse knelt, her voice soft but steady. "It's okay, you're safe." They didn't understand the words, but something in the tone made them pause. According to official U.S. Army records, 14 temporary refugee centers were set up across Okinawa in May 1945. Over 100 tons of food, blankets, and medical supplies were distributed to captured civilians in the first month alone. To the Americans, it was procedure. To the captives, it was something beyond comprehension, mercy from the enemy. Inside the tent, a boy lay shivering with fever. A medic dabbed his forehead with water from a canteen. The mother flinched each time he moved, expecting pain. When the nurse pulled a blanket over the boy, the woman whispered, "Why?" The interpreter answered softly, "Because he's a child." That answer broke something invisible. The women exchanged uncertain looks. No one spoke of loyalty or shame, only hunger, exhaustion, and the faint, guilty relief of being alive. Outside, soldiers stacked crates labeled rations, civilian use. A few yards away, another tent stitched up wounded Marines. The same hands that had fought hours earlier now worked side by side with medics. "I don't understand," one woman murmured, staring at the nurse's bandaged arm. "We are their enemies. The interpreter translated, the nurse simply shrugged, rules are rules. That night, under the dim lantern glow, the women lay awake listening to the foreign hum of generators and the low whistle of wind. No guards, no locks, just the strange, terrifying freedom of survival. And by morning, rumors began to spread, whispers of kindness too dangerous to believe. By dawn, the whispers had spread like smoke. The Americans give food to captives. At first, no one believed it. Inside the camp, women huddled together, still half expecting the soldiers to turn on them. But when the morning trucks arrived, stacked high with crates stamped U.S. Army rations, disbelief began to crack. The interpreter, a former Okinawan schoolteacher pressed into service, shouted through a megaphone, translating the American sergeant's orders. All civilians will receive meals, even infants. His voice shook slightly. Even he couldn't believe what he was saying. The soldiers began unloading the crates. Canned corned beef, powdered milk, sacks of rice. The smell of cooked grain rose into the humid air, cutting through weeks of starvation. Reports from May 1945 confirm it. U.S. forces distributed nearly 250,000 rice portions a day to civilians during the Okinawa relief phase. To the military, it was logistics, part of the stabilization plan. But to those watching from behind the tents, it looked like sorcery. Food had become the new weapon, and this one disarmed everyone. One woman stood apart, arms folded. Her name, according to a later interview, was Aya. She had lost her husband at sea and spent 37 days hiding in a hillside cave with 2 children. She watched the soldiers hand out rations and muttered, lies. When the interpreter offered her a can, she spat on the ground. They want us to trust them, then they'll kill us. But her youngest son was already reaching forward. He took the can, struggled to open it with his small hands. A soldier crouched, smiled, and showed him how to twist the metal key. When the lid popped open, a warm, oily scent filled the air, corned beef, unfamiliar and heavy. The boy sniffed it like an animal, then ate. Aya stared, trembling between fury and relief. Every rumor she'd grown up with, that Americans were monsters, that surrender meant slavery, collided with what her eyes now saw. The contradictions hurt more than hunger. She didn't know what to believe. And just when her guard began to fall, she noticed the woman in the olive, drab uniform watching her child. A woman with a Red Cross armband and a quiet smile that didn't look like war at all. The woman in the olive drab uniform wasn't a soldier, she was a nurse. Sweat streaked her temples, her sleeves rolled up to the elbows, the Red Cross armband smudged with dust. She knelt beside a crying child whose leg was wrapped in rags stiff with dried blood. The boy whispered Akosen, reaching for his mother. The nurse hesitated, then, without understanding the word, began to hum softly. The tune was shapeless, just sound, but it calmed him. The women watched in stunned silence. Their own army had warned them never to expect mercy. Yet here was an American tending to one of their children with care that felt almost maternal. According to the 10th Army's medical logs, over 50,000 Japanese civilians received treatment in the first 2 weeks of occupation: frostbite, infections, shrapnel wounds. But the numbers couldn't capture what was happening in that tent. 2 enemies bound by the sound of a lullaby. Aya stood near the entrance, arms folded tight. She didn't trust it. Why would she touch him? She muttered to the interpreter. Because he's a child. He replied again, the same words he'd said yesterday, but somehow heavier now. The nurse looked up, meeting Aya's stare. No triumph in her eyes, just exhaustion. You're safe here, she said slowly. Aya didn't respond, but she didn't turn away either. Later, when the nurse cleaned Aya's arm, a burn from a grenade blast, Aya flinched at every movement. The antiseptic stung. The nurse whispered, "It's okay," again and again, like a broken prayer. When it was over, Aya realized something strange. The nurse's own hand was shaking. That night, the women sat together outside the tents, staring at the stars. Someone whispered, "She sang for him." Another replied, "They pretend kindness." No one answered. They didn't know if it mattered anymore. Aya lay awake for hours, replaying the nurse's face in her mind. The warmth in her voice felt more dangerous than any weapon. Because if kindness was real, then everything she had been told about honor, purity, and death was a lie. But mercy in war always comes with shadows, and the next night, the shadows began to move outside the fence. The night smelled of kerosene and salt. The camp generators had gone quiet, and the women huddled close under thin blankets. Aya lay awake, eyes fixed on the dim lantern glow leaking through the tent flap. That's when she heard it, a faint whisper beyond the wire. Words in Japanese, urgent and low. She froze. Another voice answered, closer this time. Outside the fence, a group of Imperial loyalists crept through the brush. They were remnants of the shattered garrison, men who refused to believe the war was lost. Their orders were self-given now. Rescue the women, cleanse their shame, even if it meant killing them first. To them, surrender was infection, survival treason. One of the soldiers inside the camp spotted movement and shouted, "Perimeter!" Boots thudded, rifles snapped up. The floodlights roared to life, cutting through darkness like blades. The women screamed, covering their children. Aya dragged her son close, heart hammering. The same fear she'd felt in the cave came flooding back. Only this time, the danger wore her own flag. Reports from that night mention at least 3 infiltration attempts by die-hard holdouts. U.S. guards found grenades, suicide notes, and cyanide vials among the bodies the next morning. Some attackers never fired. They were simply waiting to die within sight of the camp they despised. Aya's interpreter later recalled hearing one phrase shouted from the dark. "Better to die pure than live in shame." The Americans didn't understand the words, but they understood the tone, fanatical, final. One burst of gunfire cracked through the night, echoing off the hills. Then silence. The women trembled, certain the Americans would turn on them next. Instead, the sergeant ordered his men to stand down. No shouting, no punishment, just the slow return of quiet. The next morning, they found 2 dead soldiers in Imperial uniforms near the fence line, faces half hidden by dirt. Aya stared at them for a long time, her stomach twisting. She realized those men had come not to save her, but to erase her. That revelation cut deeper than hunger. For the first time, Aya wasn't afraid of the Americans. She was afraid of what she used to believe. And when the next shot echoed in the distance, she made her choice to live. The gunfire faded into the hills, swallowed by the night wind. Aya clutched her son so tightly he whimpered. Around her, the camp lay frozen, mothers praying under their breath, children died and silent. Then, slowly, the realization sank in. The danger was gone. No one inside the fence had been harmed. No executions, no punishment. Just silence and the soft hiss of the lanterns returning to calm. Aya loosened her grip. "We live," she whispered. The words felt like defiance. In that whisper, something changed. It wasn't surrender anymore, it was survival as rebellion. For years, the Empire had drilled obedience, purity, sacrifice. To live as a prisoner was worse than death. But now, death had lost its meaning. Living even under enemy watch had become an act of courage. U.S. psychological reports later described this shift as cognitive collapse among captured civilians. Women who once vowed to die for honor began to nurse their children instead. One document noted a noticeable transition from fatalism to dependency within 72 hours of relief. Cold language for something quietly revolutionary. The morning after the attack, the Americans burned the bodies outside the perimeter. The smoke curled skyward, black against blue. Aya stood with the other women watching it rise. They died for nothing. One murmured. Aya didn't answer. She was thinking of the soldier who had handed her the canteen, the nurse who had sung to her son. Those faces now felt closer than the dead ones she used to honor. That day, the medics came again, clean bandages, small rations, soft instructions. A truck arrived carrying crates labeled for civilian relief. Aya stared at the neat handwriting and realized she could read the English letters now. She didn't know what the words meant, but she recognized their rhythm. Familiarity was creeping in. The enemy was starting to look human. That evening, she sat by the fire with the other women, her son eating from a dented tin plate. The food was salty and strange, but warm. She watched him chew, saw the spark of life return to his face, and felt something dangerous, gratitude. Living no longer felt like failure. It felt like revenge against everything that told her to die. And survival, like hunger, was about to lead her to the next unthinkable step, eating the enemy's food. The next morning, the air was thick with the smell of something alien, meat and grease, sizzling on army stoves. Aya blinked at the sight, U.S. soldiers stirring steaming pots, laughing softly as they worked. The women stood at a distance, wary, clutching their children. When the interpreter waved them forward, no one moved. Then one soldier cracked open a can and poured its contents into a tin bowl, a thick, oily mash of corned beef and potatoes. He set it down, backed away, and waited. Aya's son was the first to approach. He sniffed the bowl, wrinkling his nose at the heavy smell of salt and metal. The soldier knelt beside him, showing how to use the small key on the side of the can. Click, twist, peel. The lid curled back with a hiss. Aya watched, heart pounding. Every instinct said trap, but hunger argued louder. She took the spoon, hesitated, then tasted. The texture was strange, soft, too rich, almost bitter. Her eyes watered. Then, slowly, she ate again. Reports from the U.S. Army Civil Affairs Division confirmed that more than 500 zero canned meals were distributed to Okinawan civilians between May and June 1945. Nutrition teams recorded a 70% recovery rate among malnourished children in just 2 weeks. But those numbers don't describe the moral vertigo in Aya's chest, eating food from the same men who had killed her neighbors. A few women vomited after their first bites, their bodies rejecting the sudden abundance. Others cried quietly as they swallowed. One older woman muttered, "We eat their food, we become theirs." Aya looked at her son, cheeks full, eyes bright. "Maybe that's not bad," she whispered, almost ashamed. The Americans didn't celebrate their gratitude. They just kept serving, moving through the lines with quiet efficiency. Some even smiled when the children reached for seconds. The sound of metal spoons scraping against tin became the camp's new rhythm, a strange, mechanical lullaby by replacing the sounds of war. That night, Aya washed her tin plate in a bucket near the tents. The sky above Okinawa glowed faintly from distant fires, but inside the camp, everything was still. She glanced at the soldiers eating nearby, realized they looked just as tired, just as human, and then one of them raised a camera, and the war took another unexpected turn. The shutter snapped, a single flash of white against the smoky air. Aya flinched, thinking it was an explosion. But when her eyes adjusted, she saw the man holding something unfamiliar, a box with glass and metal. A camera. The American war correspondent lifted it again, focusing on the women crouched over their meals. "Hold still," he said, as if anyone could. The sound of the click echoed like a gunshot. The women didn't understand why he was doing it. To them, being photographed felt like exposure, a violation. In Japan, surrender was shame enough. To be captured on film, smiling, alive, was worse. Aya turned her face away, but her son laughed, crumbs on his chin. The photographer caught that exact moment. A boy in rags eating American food under a U.S. flag. Within days, those photos would reach the desks of editors thousands of miles away. According to Life magazine's May 1945 archive, over 200 images of civilian relief in Okinawa were filed by correspondents embedded with the 10th Army. They showed not vengeance, but mercy, not hatred, but exhaustion. For Americans back home, it was proof their soldiers had humanity left. For Japanese propagandists, it was poison. Aya didn't know any of that yet. She just saw the strange machine reflecting her life back at her. When the photographer smiled and showed her the developing print, a ghostly grey shape taking form on paper, her breath caught. That face, her own, didn't look like a prisoner's. It looked like someone waking up. But the interpreter warned her softly, "Don't let them see this in Japan. They'll call you traitor." Aya nodded but couldn't stop staring. The image glimmered in the sunlight, her child mid. Laughed the soldier handing food, the sky behind them clear for once. It was a picture that contradicted everything the Empire taught her. And somewhere beyond the camp, Allied planes began dropping leaflets filled with similar images. Photos of prisoners alive, women fed, children smiling. Aya didn't yet know that her face and her son's were about to become symbols of something far more dangerous than defeat. They were proof that mercy existed. And when those images reached Tokyo, the Empire's mask began to crack. Hundreds of miles away, the photo landed on a desk inside Japan's propaganda bureau in Tokyo. The officer who opened the Allied leaflet froze. There, printed in soft grey ink, was a scene that shouldn't exist. Japanese women alive, smiling, eating under the enemy's flag. He called for his superior. Within minutes, the small office filled with the rustle of papers and whispers sharp as blades. Impossible, someone muttered, fabrication. But the images were real. Allied aircraft had dropped nearly 10 million leaflets across Japan that summer, not with threats, but with pictures. Civilians treated with dignity. One caption read, "You will not be harmed if you surrender." It was psychological warfare of a different kind, using compassion as the payload. In the ministry's basement, technicians worked to counter it. They drew over the faces, edited shadows, and issued new posters calling the photos enemy deception. The official line, Americans were staging mercy for propaganda, yet even the most loyal officers felt something twist inside. Reports indicate internal memos from July 1945 admitting, if these are genuine, we risk losing belief in our own cause. Aya's face unknowingly had become part of this national tremor. In Tokyo's underground bunkers, her image was dissected like evidence, her son's open smile labeled subversive. To the Empire, mercy was more dangerous than bombs. Meanwhile, inside the Okinawa camp, life went on. The women didn't know that their survival was sparking panic in Tokyo's information networks. Aya noticed the soldiers receiving new orders, more deliveries, more rations, more photos. She couldn't understand the connection, but she felt it, a widening crack between the stories she'd been told and the reality she lived. A young Japanese interpreter confided one night, "They fear kindness more than defeat." Aya didn't answer, but she remembered the eyes of the propaganda officer in a pamphlet she'd once seen, cold, certain, unshakable. Now even those eyes, she imagined, might be trembling. And yet, with every photo dropped, with every rumor spread, the risk grew. The women weren't supposed to speak to reporters, but one of them did secretly. She didn't know that her words, smuggled out through a medic's notebook, would ignite the next shockwave, the letters. The women were given pencils as short, dull stubs with broken erasers. "You can write to your families," the interpreter said. Through the Red Cross, the words rippled through the camp like a miracle. For the first time in months, they could imagine home. Aya sat on the dirt floor with her son asleep beside her, the paper trembling in her hands. She wrote slowly, clumsy with fatigue. "We are alive, we have food, the Americans have not hurt us." Each stroke felt dangerous, forbidden. She wanted to say more, that her son laughed again, that she'd seen the sea, that she didn't know how to feel, but she stopped. Her schooling had taught her that language itself could betray her. So she signed only Aya and your grandson. By nightfall, dozens of letters piled up on the interpreter's desk. Mothers writing to husbands at the front. Widows writing to ghosts. Children drawing shaky stick figures of tents and smiling soldiers. When the Americans collected them, they stamped each with the red symbol of the International Red Cross. Official, safe, or so they thought. According to Post-war records, thousands of civilian letters from Okinawa were intercepted by Japanese censors. None ever reached their destinations. In government offices, clerks read them line by line, crossing out anything that hinted at compassion. The reports called such words moral contamination. Most letters were destroyed. Aya's was one of them. She would never know. Somewhere in Tokyo, her paper burned in an ashtray, the handwriting curling to smoke. A bureaucrat noted her name and wrote a single word beside it: surrendered. Back in the camp, the women waited weeks for a reply. None came. Each passing day hollowed the hope they'd briefly felt. Aya asked the interpreter if there was news. He just shook his head, maybe soon. But his eyes said otherwise. At night, the nurse found Aya sitting by the fence, staring north. "You should sleep," she said gently. Aya whispered, "If my husband knew I was alive, he'd think I was a traitor." The nurse had no answer. And yet, out of thousands of censored pages, one letter, written by another woman in another tent, somehow escaped the fire. That letter would travel farther than any bullet. No one noticed when it happened. A single envelope slipped through the cracks of bureaucracy, carried by a U.S. medic transferring supplies to Guam. Inside was a brief, careful letter written by a woman named Michiko, one of Aya's tentmates. Her handwriting was neat, deliberate, and impossibly polite. "We were told to fear them, but they gave water to our children. Please tell my village that kindness still exists." When the medic read it during his voyage, he tucked it into his journal instead of handing it over to military censors. Months later, a copy of that letter found its way into an Associated Press report in San Francisco. The headline read, "Enemy Mothers Thank You. S. Soldiers." It spread fast, printed, debated, reprinted. Radio hosts read it aloud on air, their voices breaking halfway through the line, "Kindness still exists." According to Red Cross archives, donations to civilian relief funds doubled within 2 weeks of the story's publication. In a nation exhausted by years of total war, Americans clung to that tiny proof of humanity. Letters poured in from families of soldiers, enclosing money, toys, soap, and candy for the Japanese children. Newspapers called it mercy in uniform. Meanwhile, back on Okinawa, the women had no idea any of this was happening. The medic who'd carried the letter never returned. But months later, an officer visited their camp holding a folded American newspaper. He pointed at the story, at the translated letter, and said, This came from here." Aya leaned forward, eyes wide. Michiko covered her mouth in disbelief. "My words," she whispered. The interpreter translated the headline for them. The women sat in silence, some smiled through tears. Others bowed their heads, burdened by a feeling they couldn't name, the guilt of surviving, the shame of being pitied, the strange pride of being heard. One soldier remarked quietly, "That letter did more than bullets. He wasn't wrong. For the Americans, it softened hate. For the Japanese command, it shattered control." When the war finally ended weeks later, that letter, copied, translated, reprinted, was sent back to Japan through official channels. It reached a country in ruins, its people starving but now faced with something even more disorienting than defeat. Mercy. A year later, in 1946, Aya stepped off a military transport truck into a city she barely recognized. Naha was no longer a city. It was rubble framed by smoke. Concrete skeletons where homes had been, twisted rebar like ribs jutting from the earth. Her son clung to her sleeve, staring at the sea of collapsed roofs. The air smelled of ash and kerosene, but somewhere beneath it, miraculously, there was music. A U.S. Army Jeep rolled by, radio blaring a jazz tune that didn't fit the ruins around it. The Americans had returned not as conquerors, but as builders. Trucks loaded with timber and flour rumbled through shattered streets. Soldiers handed out biscuits to barefoot children. To the locals, it looked like a new kind of invasion, one made of bread instead of bombs. According to occupation records, over 2 million tons of aid were distributed across Japan between 1945 and 1952. For people who had lived on roots and rainwater, it was salvation disguised in khaki. Aya walked through what had once been her neighborhood. The walls were gone, but the memories weren't. She found the ruins of her old school, a chalkboard still standing, scarred with bullet holes. Her son ran a finger over the chalk dust and asked, "Can we live here again?" Aya didn't know how to answer. Then, from behind them, an American voice called out, "Ma'am, food line this way." The tone was casual, almost kind. At the camp gate, a soldier handed her a small bag of flour and a chocolate bar for her boy. He grinned, holding it like treasure. Aya blinked at the sight. This uniform, this smile, this impossible reversal. "The same hands that fought us now feed us," she murmured. It wasn't gratitude yet, just confusion that tasted almost sweet. Nearby, U.S. engineers rebuilt a bridge using timber scavenged from destroyed homes. Children gathered to watch, cheering when the final plank dropped into place. Aya's son waved to the soldiers. One waved back, tossing him a piece of hard candy. The boy laughed. Aya didn't. Her eyes filled instead. She remembered rifles rising in the cave, remembered fear so thick it had weight. And now here, the same uniforms gave her son sugar. As she watched the boy unwrap it, she realized mercy hadn't ended with the war. It had become the reconstruction itself. But that mercy had begun with a single choice, those rifles that didn't fire. She still dreamed about it sometimes, that day on the hillside, the cave breathing smoke, the rifles glinting in the sun. In her sleep, Aya always waited for the sound that never came, the shot, but it never arrived. Instead, there was only the soft click of safety levers being switched off, and the sudden quiet that divided her life in two. Years later, even as her son grew tall enough to read English signs and work alongside American engineers, that silence still echoed louder than any explosion. By 1950, Okinawa had transformed. Roads carved where trenches once were. Schools rebuilt, the U.S. had turned the island into a hub of logistics and relief, pouring in fuel, food, and medicine at industrial scale. Civilian survival rates had exceeded 80% in American held zones, an unthinkable number for 1945, when surrender had meant extinction everywhere else. To the military, it was efficiency. To Aya, it was grace. One evening, she walked to the edge of the rebuilt port, waves tapping the docks. Her son stood beside her, now wearing an American-issued work shirt. "You remember the cave?" he asked softly. Aya nodded. "I remember the guns." He looked at her, puzzled. "Why didn't they shoot?" She smiled faintly. "Because someone chose to stop." That was the truth she carried, that mercy isn't weakness, it's interruption. It breaks the rhythm of destruction mid-beat. For all the weapons built, all the orders given, everything had changed because one man's hand trembled and lowered his rifle. The war didn't end that day, but something inside her did, the certainty that enemies had to be monsters. Reports later described similar encounters across Okinawa, thousands of civilians spared, fed, and housed. But those were statistics. Aya's memory was personal, a face under a helmet, dirt, streaked, tired human. When she closed her eyes, she could still see his hand lowering the weapon, the sunlight catching on steel as it dipped. That motion had started a chain reaction of life, letters, photos, food, rebuilding, all traced back to one refusal to kill. The rifles had been raised to end them. Instead, they marked a beginning.